So, Paul, you're now a media superstar. You have your own documentary that airs at night. But just to recap, to have a brief summary, you used to work in the Silicon Valley, where you created and founded Base Impact. Then you came back to France. Can you tell us why you came back and what was Base Impact for and it is about?
Yeah. So the vision behind Base Impact is that we can use algorithms to address social issues and to empower people at scale. So a couple years ago, it was 2014, I was working as a data scientist in Silicon Valley. And the thing that really struck me is when you're a data scientist in the Valley, you see the power of algorithms. You see that you can build technology that can scale to millions of users. We tend to use it to solve problems that are not that meaningful. You tend to use it to make people click on ads or things like that. And I really saw the discrepancy between, when you, by day I used to work, at Eventbrite. Everyone's talking about how we can use algorithms to change the world, make 1 million people click on ads. And then at night, when you do volunteering, you work, as a volunteer to help feed the homeless, for example. You'll help like 1% at a time, and you know that there's like 10 people in line behind you, and you know that there's like 1,000 people more on the streets behind the door. And so the question was, how do we reconcile these two? How do we make it so that we can actually drive impact at scale, and not something that just like where you can just help like 10, 100 people, but how can you help 1,000, 10,000, 100,000, 1 million people? And given the scale of the social issues that we're talking about today, I mean, it sounded logical to try to do something, and so that's why I quit everything to start Base, which is a nonprofit. And originally in the United States, so we worked on a couple areas. We worked with hospitals on how we can predict hospital readmissions using data. We worked with state governments to better measure police violence and help predict it and prevent it. And about 2 years ago, I moved back to France to start Base Impact here, so working on our biggest project now, which we'll talk about in a second. It's a platform for unemployment. And I think the impetus for coming back to France was, I mean, there was a lot of circumstantial things as well. But I think the main thing was realizing that at some point, when you start building technology that affects people on a large scale, and when you want to drive social good, at some point you have to think about what's your relationship with government and with public services. And it's a culture that I found really resonated here in France, whereas in the US, people don't really understand why you need government. You're trying to improve public services, and people are like, why do you try to improve public services?
What you're saying is that to improve public services, you need public services.
Or at least you need some kind of concept of public services, right? When I talk to people in the U.S. about can we build something to help empower the unemployed, people will be like, well, why do you need to help the unemployed? It's on them if they can't find a job. And I think the idea that there's something beyond the market and that there's a notion of the public interest and something that requires special attention. That's an idea that's much more prevalent here in Europe and especially in France.
So you came back and you actually tackled this issue of unemployment that we were just discussing by launching one of your biggest projects ever, which used to be called Bob Emploi, and now it's just called Bob. Yeah. It's been live now. You've worked on it for 3 years. It's been live for 1.5 years almost. How is Bob doing?
Yeah. So to give a little bit of context for people who for people who are not familiar with Bob, so the idea is basically an AI unemployment advisor. So what it does is, if you're unemployed, you can go on the platform, fill out some information, and then what the algorithm will do is it will cross your information with labor market data and data on past job seeker profiles and pathways that we've seen in the past. And then based on all this information, it will give you a personalized assessment and automated advice. So say things like, based on what I know about you, it seems like the bottleneck is here, so maybe on your job search strategy. So you could look at, this or that to alleviate that. It sounds like you're having maybe a lower morale, and we've seen that something that tends to work in the research literature is that you go maybe volunteer if you're long-term unemployed, or maybe these skills will make you more employable, and so we would recommend that you do that. or if you're Macron, we could say, maybe if you cross the street,
Yeah.
you have a high chance of being employed.
So it's both Bob and Google Maps at the same time. Okay.
We don't have that one yet.
But does it work? A year
yeah.
and a half in, does it work? Has it helped people, and if so, how many, to get the jobs and famously cross the street?
In the past year and a half, we have helped 150,000 unemployed people. I mean, of course, there's a lot more people to help,
but these are people
who
found a job thanks to Bob.
So it's people that we've been able to accompany through the platform. So when we do impact evaluation surveys, we have about 90% of people who report that they're satisfied of the help they've gotten through the platform. And the thing we're really proud of is when we look 3 months after we provide the advice, we have about 45% of people who found a job who report that it was thanks to the advice. For reference, we're 8 people here in France. And so the idea that with 8 people using technology, you can help hundreds of thousands of people. So that's a core idea behind Base Impact. That was a core bet. And so that's what we're working towards.
And when you launched it, there was a sort of euphoria around their solution. The idea that you were a genius from the Silicon Valley who would come in and sort of, had an iPad and poof, there was no unemployment anymore. But I don't want to caricature people who reported that, but my question is actually, because of this euphoria, there were many fantasies around your solution. Yeah. Does that show, again, that we're expecting too much of just the technology, that there's this idea that we will solve everything through digital?
It's a complicated question, I think. I think part of that is for sure because of how the media tends to emphasize things. But I think more or less cynically, I think what it shows is that there's a deep appetite for solutions. Because especially in France, we're used to seeing negative news and people people talking about how the world is going to shit. And I think people need solutions. They need credible solutions that they feel can, again, scale. And so I think in our case, there were many things that that participated. I think there's the whole coming back from Silicon Valley, comes from the suburbs, whatever. So we were the first to gain access to Pôle emploi, so the French National Employment Agency's data. So that in itself was quite a big thing, and we had to do quite a bit of lobbying for. Which, as you now know, is not always a bad thing. So I think that in itself started making people a little bit curious, right? How can young people you haven't heard of negotiate directly with ministers, heads of states, public agencies to do something new? So I think that in itself created a lot of attention and probably also a lot of fantasies. And of course, it's always hard to say. It's always easier to say, this magical application is going to solve unemployment. Whereas in reality, what we're doing is we devised in a cost-efficient way to, thanks to algorithms at a very low marginal cost, improve someone's ability to be employed after some amount of time. Of course, it's less catchy. So it tends to be the subtlety tends to be a bit lost in translation. But maybe it leads me to make a point here, which is that I think when it comes to social good, we tend to underestimate the long-term impact of technological disruption. We tend to overestimate the short-term impact. That you talked earlier about Evgeny Morozov and the whole idea of solutionism. And it makes sense, right? Because everyone wants change now, right? You don't see many conferences called change later.
But there is an idea there, huh?
But when you look at how innovation works, it's always you start small and the real change is actually undercover. Maybe at face value you see the gadget of a magical algorithm solves everything, and maybe in reality the most subversive thing that's actually happening is, well, wow, thanks to technology you can actually change the way that we build public services. Maybe the real story here is not that some people, some geniuses are solving things, but it's maybe that everyone as a citizen now has the power to act and has the power to change things. And I think that's actually much bigger than the original thing.
And actually, what you're talking about is a whole range of initiatives that are trying to tackle issues. And when you look at the issues they're tackling, Tech-Fugees that are helping refugees, Simplon is helping with education, Make.org is helping with social issues. Does that mean that there is no such thing as a how could we say, a public monopoly of public good? Is there any sector that, for example, you see that you can't go in and try and help?
I don't think there's some that you can't, but there may be some that you shouldn't. Maybe to take a step back, when we talk about the fact that government is losing its monopoly on public services, I think that's an important thing that we need to unpack. And so here, the cool thing that's happening is, in the past, if you wanted to solve things at the scale of society, it was something that very few organizations had the firepower to do. And so as a result, the best system that we invented was, let's all pool some of our resources together, and then out of that common pool, let's build services to address everyone. So that pool is called taxes, and the services are called the public services. And I think what has changed now with technology is that it has really drastically lowered the barrier to entry to building services at that kind of scale. And in fact, it's already the case that government is being challenged by other types of organizations, mostly private ones. And you already see organizations like LinkedIn that are competing de facto with Pôle Emploi. You have, well, I don't want to go too political, but of course, we always talk about Facebook and Google and the power they have now. That's almost bigger than some of many states. So I think here the real question is now how or whether government is losing its monopoly. I think it's a fact. The question is, how are we going to reinvent public services now that we have this new data? And so what I personally think, and we published a white paper a few months ago called the Service Public Citoyen, so this citizen-led public service. And the idea here is that the values of public services are the things that need to remain. Maybe it's not the government that's producing the public services, but we need to make sure that maybe if everyone is being accompanied by an algorithm, if every unemployed person gets a recommendation through an algorithm, we need to make sure this algorithm is fair, is balanced, and is not just giving recommendations because they get a commission at the end, or because that's what drives more ads. And it's about how you can empower other people and citizens to build public services without privatizing the common good either. So I think that's a core issue here.
So you're saying that if we're reinventing public services, that's what we've been discussing now for an hour, you're saying it's mostly about the codes of conduct and sort of the rules rather than the service itself. So in a way, you're saying that private entities could give that service, and if they abide by a certain code, they could be called general public services?
Yes. And in fact, when we built Bob, the whole, we consider it to be to be something that has a public service philosophy. We want it to be a public service. So that's why we picked the NGO model, and that's why we are so poor. So please donate if you if you just got.
I don't know whether this is all about fundraising, getting involved. I mean,
no, I'm just kidding.
But do get involved.
If you meet Xavier Niel on the street when you exit the station, please talk to him about it. But so that wasn't the point. The point is this is what we decided to do it that way, and I think this is actually why we were able to get this partnership with the public service. The current one with Pôle Emploi.
But that means if we go into what happens to the citizen using that service, you're saying public services are now a UX matter, a problem of user experience, of just a code in which you operate.
Well, so the whole vision behind Base Impact is we want Bob to be just one example of a future generation of public services. So that's the whole vision for Base, right? Like we want to build public services in multiple domains, multiple countries, and I think to get back to your point, so it's not just a UX thing. What I really want to stress is really about making sure that we conserve the values of public services in this new equilibrium. And I think a great example here is you look at Wikipedia. To me, Wikipedia is a pretty good example of what the new generation public service can look like. It's worldwide. It doesn't stop at the frontiers. It fosters cooperations between citizens of multiple countries. And if you've ever used Wikipedia, you know that they drive this pretty aggressive donation campaign every year because they refuse to put ads on their website. And why do they refuse to put ads on their website? It's because they know that if they were to monetize content, which they could, since they have so much traffic, they know that if they were to put ads on the content, it would naturally bias the content. It would maybe lead them to prioritizing articles on Apple because the iPhone ads tend to be more lucrative and so on and so forth, and because it would basically devolve the whole principle of free information. And so in a sense, that's a public service. And so we really need to think about, in every area when we want to reinvent public services, challenge them, what are the values that we want to keep, right? If you trust LinkedIn to do your professional training, and I don't have anything against LinkedIn, I think it's a great platform. Right? If LinkedIn tells you that you need to go on lynda.com to learn Microsoft Office, and that's what's going to help you be employed, you have to ask, is it because that thing is better for me, or is it because lynda.com is a LinkedIn property, and because Excel is a Microsoft property, just like LinkedIn, right?
But so, okay, let's go back to these values. What are these values? What is the chart of the new general public interest?
Je peux demander 3 minutes? 2 minutes?
The
Okay. Well,
the good idea about being on stage that you come and get me, as the president would say.
Okay, sorry, I try to be quick.
One last question: what are these values?
Yeah. So that's a great thing, is that we actually don't need to reinvent the wheel. We have decades and even like hundreds of years of political philosophy history behind us, of people who have theorized why we need public services. In France, when we talk about public services, the values, we talk about the égalité de traitement, so it means that everyone is equal, when every beneficiary is equal. You talk about fairness, you talk about neutrality, you talk about ubiquity. It needs to be something that doesn't filter out people. And so when we want to think about the values of public services, we just need to look at the political history tradition. So the only thing that changes is really the only thing, but it is big, but it's also a small thing. It's that the people who produce the public services will change. In the past, we used to say something's a public service because it was built by a public organization, by the government. So now we say something's a public service because it satisfies the values and the principles of a public service. Yeah.
Well, with that, in an hour and 15 minutes, we've just reinvented the general public services. Yeah. And before they come and get us, because they will, I want to thank you, Paul, of course, and I want to thank you all for taking part in this conversation. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you.